The boy who learned too late. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Tonight, like every night for the past 15 years, the establishment catered only to those whose wealth could be measured in billions rather than millions. The waiting list stretched 2 years long, and even then, only the right names ever made it through those gilded doors. Thomas Whitmore Jr. sat at table 7, the same table his father had reserved permanently since the restaurant's opening. At 38 years old, Thomas embodied everything that generational wealth could produce. A custom-tailored Brioni suit that cost more than most families earned in 6 months, handmade Italian shoes, and a Swiss watch that could have funded a small school. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw strong and clean-shaven, and his eyes held that particular emptiness that comes from never having wanted for anything. Across from him sat not a business associate or a date, but a little boy in a bright blue suit. The child, no more than 8 years old, looked uncomfortable in the formal attire, his bow tie slightly askew. His name was Marcus, and he was crying. The other diners pretended not to notice, as wealthy people often do when confronted with raw emotion in their carefully curated spaces. They continued their conversations about market volatility, upcoming galas, and vacation homes in Aspen or the Hamptons. But the staff noticed. They always noticed everything. Elena Rodriguez had been working at Lumiere for 3 years. She'd immigrated from Guatemala at 19, worked 3 jobs while studying hospitality management at community college, and clawed her way up from dishwasher to server at one of New York's most prestigious establishments. Every shift, she sent half her paycheck back home to her mother and 2 younger sisters. The rest went toward the closet-sized apartment she shared with 2 other women in Queens and her own daughter's daycare. She approached table 7 with the same professional grace she brought to every interaction, even as her heart broke a little at the sight of the sobbing child. She'd seen Thomas Whitmore Jr. dozens of times before. He always left exactly 15%. Never more. Calculated to the penny, and never made eye contact with the staff. She knew his type. Born into so much privilege that the people who served him had become invisible. "Is everything all right?" Elena asked softly, directing her question to the boy even as protocol demanded she address the billionaire first. Marcus looked up at her with tear-stained cheeks. Before he could speak, Thomas cut in, his voice carrying that particular edge of annoyance that the wealthy reserve for inconveniences. "We're fine. He's just being dramatic. Children need to learn composure in public settings." Thomas didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on his phone screen where stock prices scrolled endlessly. "Bring the next course." But Elena couldn't walk away. Something about the boy's desperation pulled at every maternal instinct she possessed. She knelt down slightly, bringing herself to Marcus's eye level, breaking at least 3 rules of fine dining service protocol. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked gently, her slight accent softening the words. Marcus hiccuped, wiping his nose with the cloth napkin that probably cost more than Elena's weekly grocery bill. "I want my mom," he whispered. "I want to go home. This place is scary, and the food is weird, and nobody here smiles." Thomas finally looked up from his phone, irritation flashing across his handsome features. "Marcus, we've discussed this. Your mother thought you needed male guidance, structure. This is a business dinner. You're learning how the real world works. The real world." Elena couldn't help herself, the words escaping before she could stop them. She stood up, facing Thomas directly now. "Sir, with respect, this child is terrified. I don't recall asking for parenting advice from the help," Thomas said coldly, finally making eye contact with her for the first time in 3 years. His gaze was ice. "Do your job." Elena felt the familiar sting of dismissal, the casual cruelty of being reduced to a function rather than recognized as a person. She'd felt it 1,000 times before, but somehow, tonight, in front of this scared little boy, it cut deeper. "Of course, sir," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. She straightened and turned toward the kitchen, but not before placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "It's okay, boy. I'm here now." The phrase was simple, meant only to comfort. But as she walked away, Elena didn't see Thomas's face suddenly pale, his hand clutching at his chest as if struck. She didn't see the phone slip from his fingers and clatter onto the imported porcelain plate. She didn't see the way his eyes suddenly filled with something that might have been recognition, a regret, or the first crack in a wall built over decades. Because 28 years ago, in a very different place, another boy had cried. That boy had been Thomas himself, just 7 years old, sitting in the back of a limousine while his mother was rushed to the hospital. His father, Thomas Whitmore Sr., had been on his phone then too, barking orders about a merger while his son sobbed in terror. A kind woman, their housekeeper Maria, had pulled young Thomas close and whispered those exact words. "It's okay, boy. I'm here now." He'd forgotten that moment, buried it under years of boarding schools and business training and the systematic elimination of anything resembling vulnerability. His father had taught him that emotions were weaknesses, that workers were resources, that empathy was something you couldn't afford if you wanted to stay on top. But in Elena's simple act of kindness toward Marcus, Thomas saw a ghost of his own forgotten childhood. He saw Maria, who had been fired the following week for overstepping boundaries, when she dared to suggest that young Thomas needed counseling to deal with his mother's death. He saw all the people he'd stepped over, ignored, or treated as invisible in his climb to maintain the empire his father had built. Marcus was still crying, quieter now, but with the hopeless sound of a child who knows no comfort is coming. He was the son of Thomas's ex-girlfriend, a woman who'd begged Thomas to spend just one afternoon with her boy, to show him some attention, some guidance. Thomas had agreed only because it might look good for his image, the benevolent billionaire mentoring a child. The reality was he'd planned to sit through dinner, take a photo for social media, and never think about it again. Elena returned with the next course, moving with practiced efficiency. She set the plates down carefully, and Thomas noticed for the first time the wedding ring on her finger. Thin, simple gold, and the way her hands were rough from work, so different from the soft, manicured hands of the women in his social circle. She was probably his age, maybe younger, but her eyes held a weariness that came from actual hardship, not the performative stress of managing multiple vacation homes. "Thank you," Thomas heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd thanked service staff? Elena looked surprised but nodded politely. "You're welcome, sir." "No. I mean." Thomas paused, struggling with something he couldn't name. "Earlier. Thank you for being kind to him. Any decent person would be kind to a scared child, sir," Elena said softly, and there was no judgment in her voice, just a simple statement of fact that somehow felt like an indictment nonetheless. She walked away again, and Thomas looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time all evening. The boy's little hands were trembling as he tried to figure out which fork to use for the microgreens and foam and deconstructed whatever it was that constituted fine dining. He was 8 years old. He should have been eating chicken nuggets and laughing with friends, not performing composure in a temple of wealth that existed solely to remind people of their place in the hierarchy. "Marcus," Thomas said quietly. The boy looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and fearful, probably expecting another lecture. "Do you like pizza?" Marcus blinked, confused. "Yeah, good pizza. Like the kind from a place with plastic tablecloths and a guy named Sal who's been making it the same way for 40 years. For the first time that evening, something like hope flickered across the boy's face. "Really good pizza." Thomas found himself smiling, and it felt strange, like using a muscle that had atrophied. "The best. I know a place, but we have to walk there. About 15 blocks. Is that okay? Can we go now?" Marcus asked, his voice small but eager. Thomas looked around Lumiere, at the self-important diners and the oppressive formality and the staff who worked their fingers to the bone serving people who would never see them as fully human. He thought about his father, who died 2 years ago without ever once saying, "I love you," or, "I'm proud of you." He thought about his own life, a carefully constructed monument to success that felt, in this moment, like a beautifully decorated tomb. "Yeah," Thomas said, standing up. "We can go now." He flagged down Elena, who approached with concern. "Is something wrong with the food, sir?" "No, it's perfect. It's always perfect. That's kind of the problem." Thomas reached for his wallet, pulling out his credit card. "Can you close out the check? And," he paused, his hand shaking slightly, "add a tip. A real one. Whatever you think is fair for putting up with people like me." Elena's professional mask cracked slightly, confusion crossing her features. "Sir, I don't understand." "I don't either," Thomas admitted. "Not really. But that thing you did earlier, comforting him when I was too absorbed in my own importance to notice he was suffering. That was more valuable than anything else that's happened in this place tonight. Maybe ever." He scribbled his signature on the check, writing in a tip that would equal her monthly salary. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness matters." As they left, Marcus slipped his small hand into Thomas's larger one. It was tentative, testing whether this sudden warmth was real or just another adult trick. Thomas squeezed gently, and the boy squeezed back. They walked through the Manhattan streets, leaving behind the hushed elegance of Lumiere. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor. Marcus chattered nervously at first, Then with growing enthusiasm as he realized Thomas was actually listening, actually responding with more than corporate platitudes. "My mom says you're really important," Marcus said as they walked. "But you seemed sad in there. Are important people always sad?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Maybe some of us are. Maybe we forget how to be happy because we're so busy trying to look successful." "That seems dumb," Marcus said with the blunt honesty of childhood. Thomas laughed, and it was real, not the practiced chuckle he used in board meetings. "Yeah, it really does." They found Sal's Pizza 3 blocks off their route, a tiny place wedged between a laundromat and a nail salon. The fluorescent lights hummed, the booths were patched with duct tape, and it was absolutely perfect. Sal himself, a 70-year-old man with flour perpetually dusting his forearms, greeted them with the same warmth he'd show any customer, utterly unconcerned that a billionaire had just walked into his establishment. "What can I get you guys?" Sal asked, his Brooklyn accent thick as the pizza dough he was kneading. "What do you recommend?" Thomas asked, and he meant it, actually wanted this stranger's opinion rather than just issuing orders. "For the kid, plain slice, can't go wrong. For you, you look like you need the works. Everything on it. Life's too short for boring pizza." They sat in a booth, Marcus swinging his legs happily as he devoured his slice, cheese stretching gloriously from his mouth to the plate. Thomas bit into his own slice and tasted something he hadn't experienced in years: simple, uncomplicated joy. No one here cared about his portfolio or his pedigree. The pizza was just good, and that was enough. "This is way better than that fancy place," Marcus declared, tomato sauce decorating his chin. "Why do rich people eat food that doesn't even taste good? I think." Thomas considered carefully. Sometimes people forget that expensive doesn't mean better. They get caught up in how things look instead of how things feel. "My mom says feelings are important," Marcus offered. "She says it's okay to cry when you're sad, and that people who say it isn't are lying to themselves." "Your mom sounds very smart." "She is. She works at a hospital. She helps people get better when they're sick." Marcus paused, his young face growing serious. "She said you had a really hard time when you were little, that your mom died and your dad wasn't very nice to you." "Is that true?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. No one in his adult life talked about his childhood. It wasn't discussed in his circles. You buried trauma under achievement and carried on. "Yeah," he managed. "That's true. I'm sorry," Marcus said simply. "That must have been really scary and sad." And just like that, from an 8-year-old child in a pizza shop, Thomas received something he'd never gotten from his father, his ex-wives, his business associates, or his therapist: simple, uncomplicated acknowledgement of his pain. "It was," Thomas whispered, and he felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 28 years. "It really was. But you're here now," Marcus said, echoing Alina's words with unconscious wisdom. "And we're having pizza, so maybe some things get better." Thomas looked at this child. Not his son, not his responsibility, just a kid who needed someone to see him, and felt a purpose solidify that had nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe they do." They finished their pizza slowly, talking about Marcus's school and his favorite video games and his mom's terrible singing voice. Thomas told stories about his own childhood before everything went dark, memories he'd suppressed for decades bubbling up in the warmth of Sal's fluorescent-lit establishment. He talked about the treehouse his mother had helped him build, the way she'd read to him every night, her laugh that could fill a room. "She sounds nice," Marcus said. "I bet she'd be happy you're being nice to me." "I hope so," Thomas replied, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. When they finally left Sal's, Marcus was yawning, his earlier distress completely forgotten. Thomas called his driver to take them back to Marcus's apartment in Brooklyn, and during the ride, the boy fell asleep against his shoulder, small and trusting in a way that made Thomas's heart ache. Marcus's mother, Jennifer, answered the door in scrubs, obviously just home from her shift. Her eyes widened at the sight of them. Her son asleep on the shoulder of one of New York's most eligible bachelors, both of them casual and relaxed in a way that seemed impossible. "We had pizza," Thomas explained quietly, not wanting to wake Marcus. "I'm sorry about dinner. I was being who I thought I should be instead of who I needed to be." For him. For anyone. Jennifer's eyes glistened as she carefully took her son, who murmured sleepily but didn't wake. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the expensive dinner or any of that. Just for seeing him. For being present." As Thomas rode back to his penthouse, $50 million of emptiness overlooking Central Park, he thought about Alina's rough hands and Sal's warm greeting and Marcus's simple forgiveness. He thought about his father's cold efficiency and his own hollow success and the way he'd spent 3 decades building walls that kept out pain but also kept out anything resembling real human connection. The next morning, Thomas didn't go to his office. Instead, he went back to Lumiere, arriving before the lunch service. He found Elena in the staff area, polishing silverware for the day's service. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, startled. "Sir, the restaurant doesn't open until—" "I know. I wanted to talk to you about yesterday." Thomas ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of nervousness that his business rivals would have found shocking. "What you did for that boy, the way you saw him when I was too busy pretending to be important. I can't stop thinking about it." Elena set down the fork she'd been polishing, her expression wary. She'd been here before, had seen wealthy men develop sudden interest in the staff after one moment of humanity. "Sir, I was just doing what anyone—" "That's just it," Thomas interrupted gently. "Not anyone. Not me. Not anyone I know, actually. You had compassion when it would have been easier to just walk away. You risked your job to comfort a scared child. And I've been treating people like you as invisible for my entire adult life. Sir, I don't think. Please, just listen. I'm not good at this, at being honest, at admitting when I'm wrong. My father trained it out of me. But last night, eating pizza with Marcus in a place that doesn't even have a wine list, I felt more human than I have in 20 years in places like this." He gestured around at the restaurant's opulent interior. I want to change. I don't know how, but I want to try. Elena studied him carefully. She'd seen too much of life to be easily swayed by wealthy people's sudden revelations, had watched too many promises dissolve when convenience called. Change is hard, Mr. Whitmore. It's easy to feel inspired for a day and forget about it when you go back to your normal life. I know. You're right to be skeptical. I would be too. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This isn't charity, and it's not me trying to assuage my guilt with money. Well, maybe partly, but mainly, it's me trying to make a tiny bit of difference. Your daughter. The manager mentioned you have a daughter in daycare. Elena stiffened, her protective instincts flaring. What about my daughter? Nothing sinister, I promise. I've been thinking about education, about opportunity, about how people like me get every advantage from birth while people like you have to fight for scraps despite working 3 times as hard. He held out the envelope. This is information about a scholarship program I'm setting up. Full funding for your daughter's education, K through 12, if you want it. No strings. You can say no right now and I'll never mention it again. But if you say yes, maybe one less kid has to choose between daycare and dinner. Elena took the envelope with trembling hands. Why are you doing this? Honestly. Because 28 years ago, a housekeeper named Maria told a scared little boy that it was okay, that she was there. And then my father fired her for caring too much. I can't give Maria her job back. I don't even know where she is now. But maybe I can make sure that kindness gets rewarded instead of punished, at least sometimes. Thomas smiled sadly. Also, your daughter might grow up to be someone incredible, and she deserves the chance to find out. Over the following weeks, Thomas began dismantling the careful architecture of his isolation. He started having regular dinners with Marcus, trading Lumiere for diners and food trucks and that one Thai place where they definitely didn't speak English but the food made you want to cry with joy. He learned about Marcus's life, his struggles with math, his love of dinosaurs, his worry about his mom working such long hours. He reached out to Jennifer, offering not just money but time, showing up to Marcus's school events, helping with homework, being present in a way that was entirely new to him. At first, Jennifer was suspicious, waiting for the ulterior motive, the eventual abandonment. But Thomas kept showing up, week after week, month after month, learning that consistency was its own form of love. He started a foundation, not one of those tax shelter affairs that rich people use to appear philanthropic while preserving wealth. This one actually gave money away, targeting the people who served the wealthy, restaurant workers, hotel staff, nannies, cleaners, with scholarship funds, emergency assistance, and healthcare access. He hired Elena to help run it, paying her 4 times what she'd made at Lumiere and giving her the respect she'd always deserved. His business associates thought he'd lost his mind. "You're giving away money to waitresses?" one asked incredulously at a cocktail party. "What's next? Unionizing your employees?" "Maybe," Thomas replied, and he wasn't entirely joking. Turns out the people who serve us are actual human beings with dreams and struggles and families. Who knew? The gossip pages had a field day. Billionaire has breakdown. Discovers poor people exist, one headline mocked. Thomas framed it and hung it in his office, a reminder not to slip back into the comfortable insulation of wealth. But the hardest work was internal. He started therapy, real therapy, not the executive coaching that was designed to make him more effective at acquiring wealth. He talked about his mother's death, his father's cruelty, the systematic way he'd been taught that emotions were liabilities and people were assets to be leveraged or discarded. He learned that at 7 years old, when Maria had been fired for showing him kindness, he'd made an unconscious decision. If caring about people meant losing them, better not to care at all. So he'd built walls, tall and thick, and climbed to the top of them where the air was thin and cold, but at least you couldn't be hurt anymore. The problem, his therapist noted, is that walls keep out pain, but they also keep out joy, connection, love, all the things that make us human. You've been surviving, Thomas, but you haven't been living. 1 year after that dinner at Lumiere, Thomas organized a small gathering. Not at some exclusive venue, but at Sal's Pizza, which had become his second home. He'd helped Sal expand the business, not by gentrifying it into some trendy gastropub, but by ensuring the old man could afford to keep doing what he loved without working himself to death. Elena was there with her daughter Sophia, a bright 8-year-old who was already thriving in her new school. Marcus and Jennifer came, the boy now 9 and starting to see Thomas not as a distant benefactor but as something close to family. And Thomas had tracked down Maria, his childhood housekeeper, now 71 and living on a meager pension in New Jersey. When Maria walked in, Thomas felt everything he'd kept locked away for 28 years come flooding back. He crossed the room and hugged her, something the old Thomas would never have done, would have seen as undignified. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her shoulder. "I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you, to thank you, to tell you that those words you said to me. It's okay, boy, I'm here now. They saved me, even though I forgot them for almost 3 decades." Maria pulled back, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Mijo, you were just a child. You had nothing to apologize for. Maybe not then. But I became the kind of man who would have treated you exactly the way my father did, who would have seen you as help rather than human. That's on me, and I am sorry." They sat together, this unlikely group, and shared pizza and stories. Marcus regaled them with tales of his dinosaur phase, now transitioning into a space phase, while Sophia talked about wanting to be a scientist. Elena and Jennifer compared notes on the exhausting joy of single motherhood. Maria told stories about young Thomas that he'd completely forgotten. How curious he'd been, how gentle with animals, how much he'd loved to draw. "You drew me a picture once," Maria remembered, smiling. "A garden with your mother in it. You said it was where she was now, somewhere beautiful with lots of flowers. I kept it all these years." She pulled out a faded piece of construction paper from her purse, and there it was. A 7-year-old's drawing of paradise, rendered in crayon with all the earnest hope of a child who still believed in heaven. Thomas stared at it, this artifact of a person he'd been before grief and his father's brutality had reshaped him into something harder, colder. "I forgot I believed in beautiful things," Thomas said quietly. Maybe you can believe again, Marcus offered, his young voice carrying the weight of unexpected wisdom. You helped me not be scared that night. Maybe we can help you not be sad anymore. And somehow, sitting in a pizza joint that smelled of oregano and possibility, surrounded by people who'd taught him through example what it meant to be human, Thomas felt something that had been frozen for 28 years finally begin to thaw. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Thomas still struggled with his ingrained habits of emotional distance. He still sometimes caught himself treating people transactionally, had to actively remind himself to see the person making his coffee or delivering his packages. Generational wealth and generational trauma don't dissolve overnight, but he kept trying. He showed up for Marcus's school plays and Sophia's science fairs. He visited Maria every Sunday, learning to cook the recipes she'd made when he was young. He worked with Elena to expand the foundation, channeling his wealth toward people who actually needed it rather than hoarding it like some numerical high score in a game that didn't matter. And sometimes, when he felt himself slipping back into old patterns, he'd remember that night at Lumiere. He'd remember a scared little boy in a blue suit, and a kind woman with rough hands who'd done what he couldn't. Seen past the performance to the pain beneath. He'd remember Marcus's simple question, are important people always sad? And he'd remember his own answer. Maybe some of us forget how to be happy because we're so busy trying to look successful. But the truth was, he wasn't forgetting anymore. He was remembering. Remembering the boy who'd drawn gardens in crayon, who'd loved his mother's laugh, who'd once believed the world could be kind. And with every small act of genuine connection, every moment of presence over performance, every choice to be human rather than important, he was becoming that boy again. Not innocent, you can't unlearn pain. But open, vulnerable, willing to risk caring even knowing it might hurt. Because the alternative, the cold perfection of his former life, wasn't protection. It was just a different kind of dying, one that happened slowly while your heart was still beating. It's okay, boy, he whispered to himself sometimes, in Maria's voice. I'm here now. And finally, after all these years, he was.